Okay, now we are looking at Stephen Bright's essay called "The U.S. Will Join the Rest of the World in Abandoning Capital Punishment." So this is one other sort of issue we're looking at within the criminal justice area of applied ethics. It has a bit of an interesting, a longer history than some of the other issues. Kant famously argued that it was extremely important to execute all murderers. He thought doing so, if we failed to execute someone who committed a certain crime or failed to adequately punish someone, we failed to treat them as a rational agent. So for Kant, treating people morally is treating them as rational agents. And when you fail to punish someone, you're not treating them as a rational agent. So my daughter might do something that I consider bad, like she might lie to me, and I may not punish her for it, right? And maybe that's because I think, okay, well, she doesn't really know better. She's not fully rational. I don't hold her responsible in the same way I would if a student in my class, cheated on an exam or something to that effect. So the issue has a long history, which makes it somewhat interesting. Rachel talks about Kant's arguments for capital punishment in the textbook. I believe in the Kant chapter, one of the Kant chapters, I forget which one. So anyhow, Bright is arguing in his essay that capital punishment should be abolished. So his argument is not crystal clear at all points in time, but it centers around a general sort of some related claims, which are that capital punishment is unfairly enforced. It has a sort of racist history and legacy, and it's still unevenly enforced. So if you're African American, you're much more likely to be executed, or if you kill especially if you kill a white person. So there's a racial element to who gets assigned this particular punishment. And that's important to talk about because there are a lot of murders in the United States. So one of the statistics he cites, out of 20,000 murders in the United States, I think that's in a year, only 300 people are sentenced to death, and only 55 more are actually executed. So it's inflicted in less than 1% of all murder cases. It's not in all states, it's only in some states, it's only some people in those states. He notes that Texas and Virginia have carried out 45% of those executions. So part of the argument here, part of it, is that it's not evenly enforced. It's not that every case of murder gets a sentence of capital punishment. So that's one sort of line of reasoning that's sort of goes on throughout this paper. The other line of reasoning is, the other main line of reasoning is that a lot of people who are sentenced to capital punishment are later exonerated. So the idea that the criminal justice system sentences innocent people to death, and sometimes they're killed. We can be sure that many of the people, some significant percentage of people that are executed, were actually innocent. So that's the other line of reasoning. In general, there's this idea that a legal system is the punishments of a legal system are not perfect. No judge, no jury, no trial is perfect. No legal system is perfect. And that with capital punishment, you fail to account for this fallibility of a criminal justice system, of a court, and not just sort of normal fallibilities, but especially fallibilities of a history of racism and discrimination that plague this particular issue, the way Bright sees it. And then there's some other general sort of arguments there. So he discusses the United States' place within the world, its moral standing, and he thinks that there's an argument there that the U.S. So I'm not sure if what the argument exactly is if it's that the United States should be a moral exemplar, and the fact that we are carrying out capital punishment, we failed in that regard, or if it's more along the lines of, no, it seems to be that the moral standing seems to be that we're supposed to, capital punishment is harming our moral standing in the world. I guess you could take the particular statistics around the fact that we're one of the few countries that still execute people, and we're not in good company. Other countries that execute a lot of people are China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. So basically, he quotes the statistic that the U.S., China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia account for 90% of all the executions in the world. So you generally don't want to be in the same company of those countries. Iran and Saudi Arabia, of course, are not secular governments. They're religious fundamentalist governments. China is not a democracy, and none of those countries are democracies. Bright notes that Russia has abolished the death penalty, as have many other countries. So, all right, those are his basic arguments. We'll kind of just run through a few quotes and some statistics that bolster those claims real quick. So, Bright says the United States will inevitably join other industrialized nations in abandoning the death penalty, just as it has abandoned whipping the stocks, branding, cutting off appendages, maiming, and other primitive forms of punishment. It remains to be seen how long it will be until the use of the death penalty becomes so infrequent as to be pointless, and it is eventually abandoned. In the meantime, capital punishment is arbitrarily and unfairly imposed, undermines the standing and moral authority of the United States and the community of nations, and diminishes the credibility and legitimacy of the courts within the United States. So he says, although many Americans support the death penalty, they don't know its dark history as part of the legacy of slavery, lynching, racial oppression, and legal lynchings. So that's highlighting this idea that the death penalty has this historical connection with racism, with African Americans being killed by white people in the United States, and they still are, but by this method is what Bright is essentially arguing, although he's not stating that entirely explicitly, but I think there's this idea that African Americans are still being killed by white people, and it's not that lynchings were illegal before, but so this is a kind of a version of lynching in a sense, because out of 20,000 murderers, only 300 people are sentenced to death each year. So he says, here's a quote, to understand the realities of the death penalty, one must look to the states that sentence people to death by the hundreds and have carried out scores of executions. In those states, innocent people have been sentenced to die based on such things as mistaken eyewitness identifications, false confessions, the testimony of partisan experts who render opinions that are not supported by science, failure of police and prosecutors to turn over the evidence of innocence, and testimony of prisoners who get their own charges dismissed for testifying that the accused has admitted to the crime. So these are all either forms of evidence that shouldn't be used, like you shouldn't be using a convict's testimony who's getting their sentence lessened or getting out of jail by testifying against someone to put someone on death row, right? And then some of them are just sort of general failures of the legal system. It says, even the guilty are sentenced to death as opposed to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, not because they committed the worst crimes, but because of where they happen to be prosecuted. So that's in certain states, the incompetence of their court-appointed lawyers, their race, and the race of their victim. This idea of court-appointed lawyers is a really big deal. So if you're accused of a crime and you have to go to court and you don't have the money to hire a lawyer, you get a court-appointed lawyer. These lawyers are oftentimes not good lawyers. So these are people that maybe weren't successful in private practice. They get paid by the government to defend criminals. They're not getting paid very much. They're usually very overworked. So you're essentially oftentimes the poorest people are getting the worst defensive lawyers, they're getting lawyers that are literally not fit to be defending them. They're maybe not qualified to run a murder trial, even though they are a lawyer, things like that. Whereas if you had a better lawyer, then you certainly would probably not get the death penalty, and you probably might not even be convicted based on this type of bad evidence. But if you don't have a good lawyer, you're kind of out of luck. Bright highlights the case of Illinois Governor George Ryan. He says he was a staunch supporter of the death penalty, but after 23 years as governor, executing 12 people and releasing 13 who were on death row but were innocent, he changed his mind. So in his 23 years, he released 13 people from death row who were innocent, and he ultimately changed his mind. He quotes Justice Harry Blackmun that the death penalty experiment has failed. So these are just the idea that death penalty just isn't working. So putting philosophical issues aside, what Bright is saying is, like, the system just doesn't work. It's failing people. Innocent people are being put on death row, and they're being killed. There's no reason to think that some of the people being killed weren't innocent if many are being released. There's just one simple sentence which I think is really interesting in the essay, although Bright doesn't expound upon it too much because the essay doesn't have a lot of philosophical argumentation in it, but he says that the death penalty has no place in a conservative society wary of too much government power. So we've talked about this idea more in terms of libertarianism, that libertarianism is the ideology that is focused on the idea that we should be wary of the government having too much power in any sphere. And that's the basic idea, the basic model of government established in the Enlightenment. All philosophers consider themselves libertarian in that sense. Basic system of checks and balances in a government. You set a government up in such a way that no one branch has too much power, no one person has too much power, because they can only serve in office for a certain number of terms. You can only be elected president twice, etc., etc. Everyone has to be elected. So you have all these different checks and balances, and in general, you keep the government as small as possible. So you certainly might think that in a libertarian society, in a society that values individual liberty, or conservative society, the term that Bright uses here, you might think, well, certainly the one power the government shouldn't have is the government shouldn't be allowed to legally kill people, right? That's the one power. If we're wary of too much government power, that's certainly the one thing we shouldn't allow the government to do. And I think that's a very interesting point that isn't talked about too much in those circles or in this context, but I think it's an interesting one. There's some other interesting claims. So he says the capital punishment serves no purpose. He says 100 companies have abolished it, and several states in the United States have abolished the death penalty. So here there's an argument about the actual effect of capital punishment. He says it does not deter crime. The South, which conducts 85% of all executions, has the highest murder rate. The Northeast, which rarely executes anyone, has the lowest murder rate. Now, those two things are not necessarily causally related. There could be other factors driving that, most likely poverty, lack of education, things like that. But general point certainly holds, which is that capital punishment isn't particularly, it's not necessary or useful in deterring crime, nor is it used that way, because 99% of murders are not punished with capital punishment. So we don't need it to deter crime, is the claim there. And no one is arguing that we should enforce capital punishment in 100% of murder cases. So it's an interesting argument of fact, but it's not a terribly controversial one. That the claim is that it's just not necessary to deter crime. And in fact, most people that are in favor of capital punishment are not in favor of it because it deters crime, but rather because they believe that murderers deserve to die. All right. The next argument is that there's something sort of inherently immoral about capital punishment. So he says capital punishment has no place in a decent society that places some practices, such as torture, off limits, not because some individuals have not done things so bad that they arguably deserve to be tortured, but because a civilized society simply does not engage in such acts. It can be argued that rapists deserve to be raped, that mutilators deserve to be mutilated. So this is the theory of retributive punishment, that people, eye for an eye, people should get what they give out. So if you kill someone, you deserve to be killed. If you harm someone in a particular way, the appropriate punishment is for you to be harmed in that way. But he says, most societies, however, refrain from responding in this way because the punishment is not only degrading on whom it is imposed, but is also degrading to the society that engages in the same behavior as criminals. So someone might be a psychopath and kill people and eat them, but we're not going to cut them up and eat them. I'm not sure exactly what sort of philosophical strain of argument Bright is sort of tapping into there. He's not in nothing in particular. You could frame it in utilitarian terms, like society would be better off overall if we abandon these things. People will be more civilized and kinder to each other or something. You could also frame it in terms of a Kantian argument that when you kill someone, you fail to respect them as a human being. So just this basic idea of you fail to respect them as a rational agent, you fail to treat them with dignity, things like that. Although Kant thought the opposite, you could certainly make a Kantian argument. So I think our Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. That's the idea there, that we're not going to treat people in a certain way, in cruel and unusual ways. So you can certainly sort of make that argument in terms of sort of basic human dignity, that there's just certain things that should never be done. Whether it makes more sense to do that from a Kantian perspective or utilitarian perspective. You could argue it from both sides. I think he's going more from a Kantian angle here. Alright. Then he has this section in the essay about how capital punishment degrades the moral standing of the U.S. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means, because I'm not sure why the U.S. has a special, or why he thinks the U.S. has a special moral standing. But I think personally it's more interesting to think about it in terms of our using other countries as a normative standard. If the rest of the world is doing something and we're one of the few countries that's not, the obvious assumption is that we're doing something wrong, especially if you look at other countries that are not, and every other country that's not doing it is not a democracy. So if China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. are responsible for 90% of executions, none of those countries are democracies except the U.S. That certainly raises questions about whether we should be doing it. Another interesting point that he raises is that the U.S. is one of the few countries that allows people to be executed for crimes they committed before they were 18. So the only other countries that have done this are Congo, Iran, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. So again, you've got, that's 6 countries. 3 of them are not secular governments. Well, 4 of them, depending on how you count Pakistan. 3 or 4 of them are not secular governments. I guess technically Pakistan's a democracy. The other countries are not well-functioning democracies, certainly. Okay. The U.S. and Somalia are the only 2 countries that haven't ratified the International Covenant on the Rights of the Child, which prohibit the execution of people who are children at the time. Alright, the last section of the essay is the arbitrary and unfair infliction of capital punishment. So, quote from Bright, he says, regardless of the practices of the rest of the world or the morality of capital punishment, the process leading to a death sentence is so unfair and influenced by so many improper factors, and the infliction of death sentences is so inconsistent that this punishment should be abandoned. So you could make the argument that either it should be abandoned or it should be enforced on everyone who commits murder, and then from there you can make it. He doesn't even consider that other possibility, but I think it's implied he thinks that would be terrible. So the points he makes: the race of the victim oftentimes influence whether the prosecutor will seek the death penalty. The race of the defendant oftentimes influence whether the prosecutor will seek the death penalty. Prosecutors often make mistakes, sometimes maliciously and sometimes just because they're overworked. Those accused of the death penalty usually cannot afford a lawyer, and the court-appointed lawyers are often unqualified and overworked. Testimony of convicts or flimsy evidence is often used in capital punishment cases. He says these are not minor isolated incidents, they're long-standing, pervasive, systemic deficiencies in the criminal justice system that are not being corrected, and in some places even becoming worse. He says over 100 people condemned to death in the last 30 years have been exonerated. Next quote he ends with says, courts will always be fallible and reversible, while death will always be final and irreversible. So a number of different sort of arguments for this claim that the United States should abolish the death penalty. Some of them turn on its racist history and its sort of current racial undertones in which how it's enforced. Some of them turn on the idea that our court system just isn't equipped to properly handle such cases, and we don't give defendants a proper lawyer in many cases. And then there's just the general idea that life imprisonment is more appropriate because it can be reversed, whereas the death penalty can't, and there will always be mistakes. So a number of different sort of strains of argument or threads of argument leading toward this conclusion. And then he has this idea about other countries comparing the United States, and I think we can take it as an interesting argument that the only other countries that regularly conduct executions are not democracies, so that makes some sense. And there's this kind of argument from human dignity that we shouldn't do certain things to people even if they deserve them in some sense. Okay, that's a basic summary of his argument for why we should abolish capital punishments.